There is a line most avoidants never cross, not because they don't feel, but because crossing it means losing control over the one thing they fear most, themselves in love. And here's the truth most people miss. When an avoidant finally crosses that line with an empath, it's not confusion, it's not accident. It's the moment their emotional defenses start losing the war. And if this is already hitting close to your experience, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe. Not for engagement, but so you don't miss the deeper patterns we're about to break down next. Because understanding this dynamic changes how you see love, attachment, and emotional safety forever. Avoidant individuals do not lack emotion, but their entire emotional system is built around protecting themselves from feeling overwhelmed by closeness. At the core, what looks like distance or disinterest is often a deeply conditioned fear of emotional loss of control. For them, intimacy is not automatically experienced as comfort. It can be experienced as pressure, exposure, or even danger. This does not mean they do not want connection. It means their nervous system associates too much emotional closeness with a threat to their independence or stability. So, when emotions start to rise in a relationship, instead of leaning in like an empath might, the avoidant instinctively creates space. This space can appear as silence, delayed replies, emotional withdrawal, or sudden changes in behavior. This reaction is not always a conscious decision. In many cases, it is a learned survival strategy developed from earlier experiences where emotional needs were not consistently met, respected, or felt safe. Over time, the brain adapts by prioritizing self-reliance. So even when they care deeply about someone, their first internal response to emotional intensity is often to step back, regulate, and regain control internally before re-engaging. This is why avoidance can seem warm and connected one moment and distant the next without clear explanation. What makes this even more misunderstood is that they are often still emotionally invested while pulling away. The feeling does not disappear, but they disconnect from expressing it openly because expression feels too exposing. So instead of communicating vulnerability directly, they manage it indirectly through distance. This is why partners often feel confused, thinking love has suddenly faded when in reality the avoidant is just trying to stabilize their internal emotional state. In relationships, this creates a cycle where closeness triggers withdrawal, and withdrawal creates anxiety in the partner, which then increases pursuit. The avoidant system reads this pursuit as even more emotional pressure, reinforcing their need to step back further. So the pattern is not about lack of care, but about how differently both nervous systems handle emotional intensity. Understanding this is important because it shifts the focus from judgment to awareness. Avoidants are not emotionless. They are often emotionally active internally, just highly guarded in expression, especially when they feel emotionally exposed or overwhelmed. Empaths tend to experience emotions in a way that is not just cognitive, but deeply embodied, meaning they don't simply understand what someone else is feeling, they actually feel it as if it is happening inside their own emotional system. This heightened sensitivity allows them to pick up on subtle shifts in tone, energy, facial expression, silence, and even unspoken tension. Because of this, they often become highly attuned to people who are emotionally distant, especially avoidants, and they instinctively try to bridge that emotional gap through understanding, patience, and presence. However, this same ability that makes them deeply compassionate can also become overwhelming when they are not aware of boundaries. When an empath connects with someone who is avoidant, their nervous system often interprets distance as something that needs to be fixed or healed. So instead of stepping back when they sense withdrawal, they lean in emotionally. They try to create safety through closeness, reassurance, and emotional openness. They may over-explain, over-give, or over-invest emotionally because they feel the other person's distance as a kind of emotional pain, not just a neutral behavior. This creates a powerful internal drive to help or reach the avoidant person, even when that person is not consciously asking for it. The challenge is that empaths often absorb emotional signals without filtering them. If the avoidant is anxious, the empath feels it. If the avoidant is distant, the empath feels the gap even more intensely. This makes them reactive to emotional shifts, especially silence or inconsistency. Instead of interpreting withdrawal as a self-protection mechanism, they may interpret it as something they did wrong or something they need to correct. This can lead to emotional overextension, where the empath starts giving more energy than they are receiving, hoping that consistency and love will eventually stabilize the connection. Over time, this dynamic can create emotional exhaustion for the empath because they are constantly adjusting themselves to meet someone who is not consistently emotionally available. Yet they continue because their core wiring is oriented toward connection and emotional healing. They believe that if they understand deeply enough or love strongly enough, the distance will eventually close. But without awareness of boundaries, this can turn into a cycle where the empath becomes emotionally responsible for the relationship's stability, which is not sustainable. When an avoidant truly cares about someone, they begin to show a gradual breakdown of their usual emotional defenses, even if they don't fully realize it themselves. Avoidant individuals are typically wired to maintain distance as a form of self-protection. So consistency, emotional openness, and sustained closeness do not come naturally to them. However, when genuine attachment forms, something subtle but important starts to shift. They begin to tolerate levels of emotional closeness that previously felt uncomfortable or even overwhelming. This does not happen in a dramatic or obvious way. Instead, it appears in small behavioral changes that often go unnoticed unless you understand what you are looking at. One of the clearest signs is inconsistency that starts to become less random over time. Early on, an avoidant may pull away frequently, disappear emotionally, or limit communication as a way to regulate internal pressure. But when they truly care, those withdrawal patterns begin to soften. They may still need space, but they return more reliably. The distance becomes less about escaping the person and more about managing their own emotional load before re-engaging. This is a key distinction because it shows attachment is forming beneath the surface of their avoidance. Another important shift is selective vulnerability. Avoidants do not open up easily, but when they develop real emotional investment, they begin sharing small personal thoughts, memories, or feelings without being pushed. These disclosures are often indirect and gradual, not full emotional exposure. They might reveal something about their past, admit a personal preference, or express a feeling they would normally keep hidden. These moments are significant because they represent a temporary lowering of their internal guard. They also begin to show presence in ways that contradict their usual distancing behavior. Instead of disappearing completely during emotional intensity, they may stay connected in small ways, such as checking in after pulling away or maintaining contact even when overwhelmed. This suggests that their attachment is starting to compete with their fear response. Most importantly, when an avoidant truly cares, their withdrawal no longer feels like rejection. It becomes more regulated and less punishing. They are no longer just escaping emotional intensity. They are learning, often slowly, how to remain connected while still protecting themselves. Silence from an avoidant person is often misunderstood as emotional absence, disinterest, or even rejection. But in most cases, it is actually a form of self-regulation rather than emotional shutdown. Avoidant individuals do feel deeply, but when emotional intensity rises beyond what feels manageable, their system automatically shifts toward distance as a way to restore internal balance. Silence becomes a protective space where they can process emotions without feeling overwhelmed by external pressure or expectations. It is less about escaping the person and more about escaping the internal emotional overload that closeness can create for them. When an avoidant enters silence, they are often not empty inside. Instead, they may be actively thinking, feeling, and trying to make sense of what is happening emotionally, but without external expression. Because expressing vulnerability can feel exposing or destabilizing, they choose non-expression as a safer route. This creates a situation where their partner sees absence, while internally there may be emotional activity that is completely hidden. The lack of communication does not necessarily match the internal experience. This is why silence can feel so confusing to an empath or emotionally open partner. The empath naturally interprets silence through the lens of emotional connection, so no response feels like emotional withdrawal or loss of interest. But for the avoidant, silence is often a pause button, not a stop button. It is a way to reduce emotional stimulation so they can feel grounded again. If the emotional intensity in the relationship becomes too high, Even positive emotions like love or closeness can feel overwhelming, leading them to step back temporarily. However, this coping mechanism becomes complicated in relationships because the partner often experiences the silence as uncertainty. This triggers anxiety, which can lead to increased attempts to reconnect, clarify, or seek reassurance. Ironically, this added emotional pressure can intensify the avoidant's need for space, reinforcing the cycle. So silence becomes not just a personal coping strategy, but a relational trigger point where two different emotional systems collide. Understanding this does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does explain why silence is rarely as simple as not caring. Empaths often unintentionally trigger avoidant individuals because of the way they approach emotional connection. An empath's natural instinct is to create closeness through openness, understanding, and emotional availability. When they sense distance, they do not step back. Instead, they lean in harder, believing that increased warmth, communication, and reassurance will bridge the gap. This comes from a genuine place of care. But for an avoidant nervous system, this level of emotional intensity can feel overwhelming rather than comforting. What the empath experiences as connection, the avoidant may experience as pressure. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to emotional intensity, especially when it feels persistent or uncontained. So, when an empath offers continuous emotional engagement, long conversations about feelings, or repeated attempts to clarify the relationship, the avoidant system may interpret it as loss of space. Even positive attention can feel like intrusion if it arrives too frequently or without emotional pacing. This is where misunderstanding begins, because the empath assumes that more connection will create safety, while the avoidant often needs more space to feel safe in order to reconnect. Another way empaths unintentionally trigger avoidance is through emotional transparency. Empaths tend to express what they feel in real time, sometimes processing emotions out loud or seeking immediate emotional resolution. While this can be healthy and balanced dynamics, for avoidance it can feel like emotional intensity that requires an immediate response or decision. If they are not ready to engage at that depth, their instinct is to withdraw rather than engage, creating a push-pull pattern. There is also the aspect of emotional mirroring. Empaths often absorb the emotional state of the avoidant and then respond with heightened emotional energy in an attempt to stabilize the connection. But instead of calming the avoidant, this can amplify their sense of being emotionally engulfed. As a result, the avoidant may step back further, not because they do not care, but because they need to reduce internal pressure. This dynamic is not about blame on either side. It is a mismatch in emotional regulation styles. The empath regulates through connection, while the avoidant regulates through distance. When both operate unconsciously, they can unintentionally trigger each other into their protective patterns. For avoidant individuals, real love is not measured through intensity, constant communication, or emotional declarations, but through stability, predictability, and consistency over time. Because their emotional system is sensitive to overwhelm, they often cannot process love in the way more openly expressive people do. Instead, they look for signals that feel safe enough for them to remain engaged without activating their need to withdraw. So real love for them is something that feels steady rather than emotionally overwhelming, even if it is deeply felt underneath. One of the clearest ways avoidants show real love is through consistency in small actions. They may not always express feelings directly, but they begin to show up in reliable ways. This can look like responding more regularly, maintaining contact even when they need space, or returning after periods of distance without fully disappearing emotionally. These behaviors may seem subtle, but for an avoidant, consistency requires effort because it goes against their instinct to retreat when emotional pressure builds. Another important expression of love is presence without full emotional exposure. Avoidants often struggle with deep vulnerability, but when they care about someone, they start allowing themselves to remain in emotionally charged situations instead of immediately escaping them. They may sit through difficult conversations, stay connected during emotional moments, or tolerate closeness longer than they normally would. This willingness to stay present, even while feeling internally uncomfortable, is a strong indicator of attachment. Avoidants also show love through selective effort. They do not open up to everyone, so when they start sharing parts of their inner world, even in small ways, it reflects trust. This might include sharing personal thoughts, asking questions about the other person's life, or showing curiosity in ways that feel more engaged than their usual pattern. These actions may not be dramatic, but they represent a shift in their emotional risk-taking. Ultimately, for an avoidant, love is proven through behavior that contradicts their avoidance patterns. When they consistently choose connection over withdrawal, even in small degrees, it shows that attachment is strong enough to challenge their natural defense system. Avoidant individuals do not cross their emotional boundaries lightly because their entire psychological structure is built around protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm, loss of independence, or perceived loss of control. For them, emotional boundaries are not just preferences, they are survival mechanisms developed over time through experiences where closeness may have felt unpredictable, unsafe, or emotionally demanding. So when they do cross these boundaries, it is not random behavior or confusion. It is a sign that something internally significant is happening that is stronger than their usual protective instinct. What usually keeps an avoidant within their emotional boundaries is fear-based regulation. They regulate emotional intensity by stepping back, limiting vulnerability, and maintaining distance when things start to feel too close or too fast. This helps them stay grounded. However, when a strong emotional attachment forms, this system begins to weaken slightly. The presence of genuine emotional connection starts to compete with their fear response. They begin to experience a conflict between "I need space to feel safe" and "I want to stay connected to this person." That internal conflict is the starting point of boundary crossing. Crossing the boundary often appears as gradual exceptions to their usual rules. They might stay in conversations longer than they normally would, respond faster than their typical pattern, or choose to remain emotionally present even after feeling triggered to withdraw. These actions are not dramatic, but for an avoidant, they require internal negotiation. Each step toward closeness is weighed against their need for self-protection. At deeper levels of attachment, avoidants may also begin to tolerate vulnerability in small doses. This can look like sharing feelings they usually suppress, admitting uncertainty, or allowing themselves to be emotionally seen in moments they would normally avoid. These are not easy actions for them because vulnerability goes directly against their protective wiring. So, when an avoidant crosses this line, it is not because their fear disappears, but because their emotional attachment becomes strong enough to challenge it. They are not free from avoidance. They are simply choosing connection despite it, which is why these moments are rare and psychologically significant. Most people misunderstand avoidance because they look at their behavior in isolation instead of seeing the nervous system pattern underneath it. When closeness increases, an avoidant does not evaluate the situation purely through logic or conscious choice. Their system reacts automatically to emotional intensity. So the cycle often begins with connection, followed by internal activation, then withdrawal as a form of self-regulation. The partner, especially an empath, experiences this withdrawal as emotional rejection, which creates anxiety and leads to increased pursuit. This pursuit then intensifies the avoidant's internal pressure, reinforcing the need to step back even more. What forms is a self-sustaining loop where both people are reacting to each other's nervous system responses rather than the actual emotional truth of the relationship. The key issue is that both sides interpret the same behavior differently. The empath interprets distance as danger to the bond, so they move closer emotionally, try to repair, explain, or reconnect. The avoidant interprets that increased closeness as pressure, so they move away to restore internal safety. Neither person is intentionally trying to harm the connection, but their coping strategies are in direct opposition. One regulates through proximity, the other regulates through space. This push-pull pattern becomes especially intense because it is intermittent. The avoidant does not stay distant permanently. They return after regulating, sometimes with warmth or affection, which gives the empath hope that closeness is possible again. This intermittent reinforcement strengthens emotional attachment on both sides. The empath becomes more invested during reconnection moments, while the avoidant becomes more cautious during overwhelm moments. Over time, this creates emotional confusion where both people feel deeply connected yet unstable at the same time. What is often missed is that the avoidant is not emotionless during withdrawal, and the empath is not powerless during pursuit. Both are operating from deeply ingrained emotional regulation strategies that were formed long before the relationship began. Without awareness, they keep triggering each other's protective systems instead of building emotional safety together. When these patterns are understood, the focus shifts from blame to recognition. It is not about who cares more, but about how each nervous system responds to closeness, and whether both people are willing to adjust their patterns enough to create stability instead of repeated emotional activation.